Hi, everyone. Some people are still coming in, but we welcome you to the webinar for today. I want to thank you guys for taking time out of your busy schedules and your day to attend this webinar. Please make sure you stay until the end. We have an attendance and form that we'd like for you to fill out at the very end. So please make sure that you stay so that you can get credit and give some feedback on today. Right. We have a disclaimer statement. If you could please close any AI devices or apps or anything connected to your screens or your computer, that is not allowed as part of this webinar. So if you could make sure that those things are closed. Any type of AI apps or devices are not allowed. Right. So I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Lori Washington. I'm an education associate here at the State Department. I work in test development and assessment, and I develop the SC Ready 6 through 8, and also the EOCEP test for Algebra 1. I have with me today Dawn Hood and Janelle here today. These are our education associates in from the Math Standards team. All right, an agenda for today. In today's webinar, we're going to do a quick overview for data review and some background information. We are going to talk about the data review reports that are on the SCDE website, and we'll answer a few questions, submitted questions. There was a link in the bio, and there were only a few questions there, so we will go over those submitted questions. So the first part for today is the overview of the data review process and the data review reports. I know that some of you have been here for a while, but I am going to, talk about data review and give some background information, because we do have a lot of people in the state that may be new to the state. So I want to make sure that I give all of the background information for those people. So what is data review? Well, we have committees created to review information. And our data review committees, they review the previous year's state level assessment results. They analyze item level operational and field test items. So they look at the test and they look at the test item by item. They identify performance trends across the state. And they pinpoint areas needing improvement. They also recommend instructional strategies based on the actual problems that they are looking at. And so the trends that we find in the state level results, it may or may not be something that applies to your particular district. So this is, state level results. So why do we do the data review, and why do we, create the reports? Well, number one, it's best practices, but also it's a part of our state law. And when you look at Section 350, Title 59, Chapter 18, it mandates certain aspects of data review, that we look at the item by item, which is the question by question. The committee or curriculum experts, they discuss, within the committee, we discuss these trends and the instructional strategies they come up with based on what they noticed about the data from those problems. So when I say curriculum experts, you're like, who am I talking about? All right, first of all, in the data review committees, and we hold these committees within the summer. So the State Department is there. So there's representatives from the State Department there. Data Recognition Corporation, DRC, that's our testing vendor for both the SC Ready and the end of course examination prep. We have committee of educators that are there. And so for each committee, it's about 6 participants that participate and give the feedback. And what they are doing is they are going to analyze the item data, develop instructional strategies to address weaknesses and identify possible trends, share opinions, and listen to colleagues. So what happens is we take all of that information that they come up with and we put it into a report. So that's what we do. We take the information from the educators and what they've said, and we publish that on the State Department website as a report to you. All right, so how can you get involved? There's for middle and high school math and for elementary, there are separate committees. And so for example, there's about 6 participants for math 6 through 8, and like another separate committee meeting held at a separate different time for Algebra 1. And what's important here, this particular meeting, I'm jumping ahead, it's a virtual meeting. It is still a secure meeting, but it is a virtual meeting. It's held in the summer. And we need to, when we put the meeting or the representation, the committee members, when we put it together, we want to make sure that we get representation from across the state. So not just only participants from the Midlands, we need representation from the whole state, because what comes up in our conversations, there's different things going on. Our state's very diverse, and there's different situations and issues that come up in our conversations that are, different from different parts of the state. And those things are taken into account as we have discussions about the test questions. We have teachers, school and district curriculum specialists, and administrators as a part of our committees. And we like to get a good mixture of those people. We like to have SPED and ML certified teachers there. And that's especially important that we have that type of representation on our committees to shed light on any type of information that applies to our different populations in our state. So it's important that we have that representation. So I encourage you, if you know someone that does not mind coming to these meetings, it'll be so great if we have, as many people possible to apply for the committee meetings. Now, so the committee application, and on the next couple of slides, I have there's going to be a couple of links, and they're all leading to our assessment quick links for teachers page. But this first one is our committee application. And so this is an advertisement, not just for data review, but we have other committees that we would like for you to be involved in. Our next data review meeting is this summer. And so for Algebra, it's going to be on June 24th this year. And for SC Ready, it's going to be, for SC Ready grades 6 through 8, it's going to be July 7th through the 8th. Okay, so those are our upcoming dates. So if you are interested in being part of our committee, I encourage you to do so. You get to actually see the test that the students have taken from the spring administration and give advice and analyze it with other colleagues. So it's a really good, interesting conversation. So on our assessment quick links for teachers page is where you can find the application, or if you use the link that directly went to the application, you could use that too. That was the previous link. All right, so what about the other committees? Okay, so the first one, let's see, the one I have here in yellow. So the first one here is our standard setting. You may or may not know that we will have a standard setting meeting this summer for middle school, 6 through 8, and also other, let's say, elementary and SE alt as well. So our standard setting meeting, we do need you to apply for that one. This particular application to be a part of the standard setting is separate from the other committee meetings. It's separate. And there is a deadline. If you go to this link here, there's the memo where all of this information is given about the standard setting meeting for math this summer. It's very important that everybody can, see the information and apply. So, and the other one, I think, and I also put the QR code here as well. So the standard setting meeting, the deadline is what I wanted you to be aware of. The deadline for that is in February. So if you are interested in participating in that, you would need to go ahead and apply as soon as possible. The other meetings that we have this summer are the content and item review meetings that are listed here, SC Ready. The dates here over here on the left. And for algebra content review, the dates are over here on the right. Okay, so, and then the data review that I mentioned before. So we do encourage you to please apply for those committee meetings. All right, so the data review reports is what we're talking about today. And some reminders about the reports, and this information is actually in the reports, but I just want you to know, like last year's administration, 2025 administration, that test was aligned to the 2015 standards. Okay. However, like the suggestions and advice for that test, we converted that to the 2025 standards so that you could be a little more familiar with what you're currently doing. Okay. And the guidance from and the recommendations, this came from your peers. Okay. So it comes from the review panel that analyzes the results and they give out these suggestions. So the report is just a report of what they said. And I do appreciate our 2025 committee that came up with a lot of great strategies and suggestions. All right, so where are the test data review reports? Okay, for this link, you could use the QR code. And I do have Dawn and Janelle again with me from the Math Standards team. One of them will be putting that in the chat for you. But if you look here on the quick links for teachers page, and that's where all of our assessment resources are found, you will see that you could scroll down to test data review reports on our page. And the SC Ready reports, they're in there by content. And you can just click on the SC Ready, or if you're algebra, here for algebra, if you scroll down a little bit further, the EOCEP assessment by content, those reports are at the bottom of that page. Okay. All right, so the data review reports, what did it say? So I kind of took a look at the observations that were given, and we're going to look at what the committee said across grade levels. And so there are 3 big ideas from the data review reports. And you might be saying, well, I'm here for middle school, and someone else might be saying, I'm here for algebra. And what's interesting is that when I looked at the big ideas and themes from all 4 reports, they were very similar. Okay, very similar. And so the first thing, and I'm sure someone could probably even guess what this first theme or topic that was mentioned in the reports would be, and that is vocabulary and making those conceptual connections, academic vocabulary and conceptual connections. And so that was something that was mentioned a lot, and that was within each grade level, including Algebra 1. For algebra, or excuse me, for all of them, for the vocabulary, some things that were said, use precise mathematical vocabulary consistently, using those anchor charts and word walls, cross-team collaboration to ensure that you and the other disciplines are using like a common language, connect the prior knowledge across your grades. And this last comment was from the Algebra Committee, keeping notebooks from 8th grade to Algebra, but it kind of needs to go to the middle school so that you can remind students, you know what, keep your Algebra, your 8th grade notebook. And at this point, they would need to keep it for more than 1 year because of the switch in our alignment here. But just a lot of the concepts that come up in 8th grade algebra, 8th grade, they're going to see that in algebra. And they had those, those conversations in the committees. So those were the big ideas. So I'm going to actually talk about some of the bullet points from the data review reports, and I'm going to just expound and shed light, a little more light on some of the comments that were, said based on vocabulary. Another thing for vocabulary, this is something that if you look at the data review report, you can see like we have like about 5 years worth of data review reports from the past ones. And what trends every time is vocabulary. It is mentioned, year by year. And if you've been here in the state for a while, you may already know those things, that it's always mentioned in those reports. And these things are what they have said even this year. So I'm going to start with 6th grade and work my way up to Algebra 1. So one of the bullet points from the data review report says, and I went ahead and put the indicator here, and that indicator may or may not be in the report. And if it wasn't, I just went ahead and put it on this in this presentation. However, for 6 DPSR 1.3, the committee suggests focusing on academic vocabulary, especially skewed left versus right. And so where this came from, or where did this come from? So this comment was based on an item where most students chose a distractor that reverses the direction of the skew, which is a common misconception. And so if you look on the data review report, they mention different ways that you could try to help students understand when the graph is skewed, what it's going to look like. And it seems like the students, they're still taking it, just literally of what it should look like. But that reversal and that skew, which something you may already know and you talk about within your classes, but what they're saying is on the state test, this particular test question, most students chose the distractor that was the opposite or reverse the skew. Okay. In grade 7, what was mentioned about vocabulary came and I just only selected just like one particular item just to point it out. 7 PAPR 3.5, it says ensure students understand key terms like absolute value, integers, and rational numbers. And this comment came, they felt like students need to know what distance means in relationship to absolute value. Now, in this particular standard, when we look at distance, absolute value, and those integer operations, 6th grade is working with that. That's being introduced in 6th grade, as of this year, but it is something that is going to come up again in 7th grade as well. And of course, last year in the 2025 administration, that is something that they were confused about, knowing what distance mean in relationship to absolute value. All right, in 8th grade, for this big idea number 1, vocabulary, in 8 PAFR for 1-3, they said the committee said you should reinforce vocabulary like constant rate of change when discussing linear functions and justifying reasoning. And where did this come from? In this particular item, many students confuse the general definition of function with that of a linear function. Okay, so they felt like the students, I guess, thought that if it is a function, that you could only have it to be a linear function. So just making sure that they understand those definitions. In algebra, in A1 DIPSR 1.4, they say to know what correlation coefficient means and use visuals to enforce this concept. So this comment came from a particular item where students were given the actual correlation coefficient, but many they weren't able to interpret the negative value, and they mistakenly concluded that it meant the model was not a good fit. So, so even though they were given the actual correlation coefficient, they were unable to interpret that. All right, so like I said, those were just like some parts pulled from the data review, but there's so much more that is listed in the data review report that expounds a little bit more on that. All right, so the big idea number 2, or the second theme that I found in the reports, was based on multiple representations and visual models. And like I said, this is from the middle school reports and from the algebra reports. It was the same. They mentioned, and these are 2 different committees, reminding you that 2 different committees, their suggestions are pretty similar, using multiple representations and visual models. So with some of the multiple representations, they noted about using, graphs, tables, and diagrams, hands-on tools, the mention of using Desmos as an aid in the classroom. And if someone can go ahead and put in the link for the Desmos, the South Carolina link. Using Desmos was brought up in both reports, and they felt like students needed to be familiar with using that. Mind you, Desmos is not the only calculator that students can use. We have some guidance on what types of calculators that the students can use, but they felt like using that within the classroom just as an aid, having students do things by hand first, and then using that other, that second representation, just to give them some guidance on understanding what they're doing. The online tools training, they felt like that came up a lot within the reports. They felt like students need to be able to be familiar with the online tools and the interface from the DRC Insight testing. So there's another link for that as well. Using color coding, things like that, drawing figures and other real world contexts as strategies, and interpreting solutions beyond just like a singular point, but understanding what those points mean. So I'm going to go into some of the representations. All right, so the big idea number 2 for 6th grade. You look here, it says we're doing PAPR 3-4. Use multiple strategies such as an area model when teaching the distributive property. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Hopefully we can edit out that pause. But for this one, for this particular strategy, this was interesting. When you look at the distributed property and this item, what was noted here was that many high achieving students chose a distractor that combined a term with a variable. So a term with a variable, like 2x or something like that, and they combined it with the constant before they use the distributive property. So those were not like terms. So they thought that using a strategy such as modeling with an area model might be helpful just so they can get that concept together. So that was the multiple strategies here. All right, so that was 6th grade. In 7th grade, one of the comments from the data review reports, this was from 7 PAFR 3-5. It says expose students to linear expressions with division represented horizontally, not just vertically. So what they noticed was when they looked at the item, they thought that teachers may not be not familiar, but may not have thought or, they just thought that students needed to be exposed a little bit more to expressions, algebraic or variable expressions, where you have the division going across. So in this item, students were given a situation and they had to select the correct expression that represents the situation. And with those expressions, they had the division symbol. So they felt like they wanted to note that. For 8th grade, the comment made about multiple representations here was about students being able to ensure the students can find the rate of change of a linear function from multiple representations, such as like a table. So in this particular standard, you are comparing two functions, but they thought that students usually have a hard time finding that rate of change if that's what's being asked for from a table. Okay. All right, so in this particular item, students selected a distractor, which is an answer option that reflected an incorrect calculation of the rate of change based on the values in the table. So for algebra, here at this is A1 NR21, when translating, this is from the data review report, when translating between rational exponents and radical expressions, they wanted you to know to expose students to equivalencies, like multiple forms of those equivalencies and not just like the simplified answer. So they thought that that was important. So in this particular item, most students chose an answer option. It appeared to be simplified. Is what the guess is, that they chose something that maybe, when I say appeared, looks smaller or something like that. However, it was not the correct answer. All right, so the next, or the third and last big idea from the data review reports was problem solving, reasoning, error analysis. So from here, in general, and this is just, summary, incorporate structured problem-solving strategies is what the committee said. Increase the reading load from the questions that you're giving. Encourage that productive struggle with the students. Require students to justify their answers, and examine, ask them to examine and interpret distractors. And I'm going to pause here. These things sound great, on paper, and I know that you are in there in the classrooms, and you are, on those front lines, and you are doing your due diligence. However you can, try to get those things done, it's kind of like you have to look at this as what you can control. There's certain things that you cannot control, but just work on the things that you can control. So, I do understand and realize, like, on paper and in theory, that these things are great. However, these comments and suggestions, these are coming from your peers, and these are the things that they said that they felt like would help the students get ready for the test. All right, so in 6th grade, problem solving, reasoning, and error analysis. One of the things from 6th grade was like from 6 NR21. And the comment from the data review report said, when comparing the rational numbers, consider teaching the process standards where the focus is on reasoning, and think of like logic problems. So in this particular item, students, they were to interpret verbal statements using equal to and not equal to. And so they felt like, maybe not just looking at something and just saying or putting the sign there, but being able to interpret those things or give some type of reasoning behind those things would be helpful. So in 7th grade, this is 7 MGSR 1.3, to help students visualize circumference. In the data review report, they said, use string to physically wrap around the circular objects and encourage them to persevere through word problems involving circumference and area. This comment came from an item where, the students chose distractors that the committee felt were obviously wrong. And so they questioned if each distractor was read through carefully. So that came up a lot in the conversations. The educators, they, in the committees, they said, oh, they should have gotten this, they should have gotten that, if only, this. And so this was definitely one of them. However, it would take someone to read through the actual distractors, like read through them carefully in order to, make a good decision. So they questioned whether they, persevered and did that. Since most of them chose something that was obviously not correct. So that was 7th grade. For 8th grade, ask students to justify, this is 8 NR22, ask students to justify why a number is rational or irrational. So this is coming from the report. And they suggest to have like a discussion or debate about why or why not, and have them explain. And this is another one that kind of looked at where it mentioned the appearance. So to shed some light on where this comment came from, students generally recognize the square root of a perfect square is rational. So perfect squares, they felt like, okay, that was something that they knew. However, when the number appeared irrational, such as the square root of a fraction or decimal. So that's what they felt like students need to be exposed more to, is something that may not appear to be irrational. So when you have like a fraction or a decimal, that is actually a perfect square, or expressions like pi over pi, they often misclassified it And it shows they may rely too much on how numbers look rather than their actual value. So for algebra, for this last big idea, here, a comment that was made was to ask students about the meaning of domain and range using real life scenarios and ask if it makes sense. Ask what happens if, and fill in the blank there, while going through several different scenarios, and tie this in with the equation and then back to the graph. So I'm just, that's coming directly from the report. Okay, so to shed some light on that, many students chose, in this particular item, many students chose a distractor that correctly noted there was a limitation on the domain. So they did realize that there was a limitation on that domain, but the explanation given didn't reflect the reasoning for that limitation. Okay. All right, so the big ideas here with the vocabulary, multiple representation, or multiple representations, and problem solving and reasoning and all of those things, like I said, all of the reports, you'll see something like that. Those suggestions that were given were all kind of like in, all in those areas. And what came up a lot within the conversations were the mathematical process standards. It's like each one or each big idea had a connection to the process standard. And it, the comments was, oh, that's just the process standards, or, oh, that's, the process standards. And so the committees, and I'm talking about both committees, they mentioned that several times. So I wanted to make sure that I, bring that out to you, is that big connection there to the process standards. And for, I know if you've been here for a while, you know what that is, but just to make sure, so our process standards are in our standards document. And the information given for the process standards, it's listed by grade band. And I gave the pages for, and they're right before, so like math 6 through 8 is on page 65 and 66. Algebra is on pages 119 to 120. And the process standards are it's just ways to demonstrate. It demonstrates the ways in which students develop conceptual understanding of the mathematical content and apply the mathematical skills. And I'm going to stop here at the process standards. This is where our lovely math standards team, they do professional development and have conversations and workshops with teachers based on these process standards. So I feel like it's something that, it's definitely something worth to make sure that we understand that we have our actual standards, and we may focus on those things, but we also have process standards. And from the assessment side, the process standards are assessed within the actual items. Okay, so we're going to go into our submitted questions, and please make sure that you hang around so that you can get the link to the form where you can get your credits for attending today's webinar. And I do appreciate everyone being able to be here today. So the last thing was, and there was only about 2 submitted questions, but I will go over them because and they're both for middle and high. So please make sure you stick around for that. And so the first question was based on the algebra test and the changes. So the question states, how will the Algebra 1 end of course test change from previous years since the standards have now been updated or changed? And they're a little worried about it being completely different because they felt like they were comfortable with what was already, or what was already done. Okay. And the answer for that here, much of the test for Algebra 1, much of the Algebra 1 test will remain the same. So it remains at 50 operational items in length. It retains the 3 reporting categories, or the amount, 3 reporting categories. Item types remain the same, and a graphing calculator, just for Algebra now. The graphing calculator is available on all of the test items. But the changes for this test in the test blueprint, it has changed some, specifically with like the names of the reporting categories. And there was a little shift in some of the indicators from the 2015 standards. However, if one of my colleagues could put the links to the memo, if you could refer to the memo, there's a memo that goes out to the state. It's titled SC Ready and EOCEP updates. And this memo lists out the changes for the Algebra 1 EOCEP test. Also, on our assessment quick links for teachers page, we have resources, some new resources listed there. For example, our assessment specifications for teachers document that can help you with some guidance as far as the Algebra 1 test. So that was the answer for the first question. And for the second question was pretty general. They wanted to know more about the SC Ready test for the 8th grade. And actually, there's another webinar coming up next month on February 19th. And if one of my colleagues can put in the chat the link for that. So the webinar is, are you down with OTT, exploring the online tools training module and SE Ready updates? But this is for grades 3 through 8. So I'll have our education associate, Laura Dasher. She is our associate for the assessment of the 3 through 5 test. And then I will talk about the assessment changes and updates for the 6 through 8 test. So that is coming up on February 19th. However, there's more resources given in on that same memo in our assessment quick links for teachers page. Okay. And I am going to wrap up things here. I hope that you have gotten something out of today's session on the SC Ready test for grades 6 through 8 and for the Algebra 1 EOCEP test. I hope that something would help you with the rest of the school year. However, I would love for you to please give some feedback. So if you could look at this post-session survey link. And on this link, you'll be able to give your information so that you can get PD credit for attending this webinar, for attendance here. And then you can also be able to give some type of feedback. I believe there may be like 2 questions asking for some feedback. But as always, we do appreciate at the department of all that you do on a daily basis. And I hope that you have a great rest of the school year. My information is given here. So if there's any, direct questions that you wanted to ask, you may send me an email.
There was a question, Lori, about will the presentation be made available? Meaning, I'm guessing the slides.
Yes, the slides will be made available. We can put them. I know the video will be available on the standards team website, and we can also make the slideshow available.
One more question. Will there be a webinar for grades 3 through 5? I'm guessing the same style webinar.
Oh, okay. Good question. So grades 3 through 5, I believe, they had a webinar last week, and I think the data review was discussed. So that's a good question. But I think that one has already talked about data review. I'm not exactly sure how much they went into it. But if you wanted to ask Laura Dasher, she's our 3 through 5 elementary assessment associate, and she develops the 3 through 5 SE Ready test. So you may email her directly if you'd like. And she will also be at the February 19th webinar, talking about the new stuff, the updates and whatnot.
All right. Question, has the OTT been updated to reflect the new standards?
Okay, that's a good question. I think we talked about that today. So the OTT, that what you have now, it does have the current technology there. However, we won't be able to update it with the new standards until after this administration of the actual test. So that particular update will be towards the end of this year, after the administration of the 2026 spring testing.
All right, and then they're asking if there are any webinars about the ELA assessments. I don't know if you have that answer or not.
I no, I do not, but that's a good question. You would have to contact our test developers for ELA and ask them if they were doing something on that. And I feel like they are doing something kind of integrated with the standards team, talking about data review. So I don't have an exact answer for that one.
That's all the questions in the chat right now.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone that has been here, asked questions. We do appreciate you taking your time out to do that. And if you have any further questions, like I said, you can email me directly if you'd like. You can put questions into the survey. And I thank you, Dawn and Janelle, for being here today, helping me out with this presentation.